All right, we're going to get started. I know people are still finding a spot, and that is just excellent. Delightful to have everyone here today. It is my honor to welcome you. My name is Janelle Hutchinson. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer here at the University of Saskatchewan. I have a few things just to share, and then I want to welcome our elder onto the stage so that we begin things in a good way. Before we begin, of course, it's important to start with a land acknowledgement because acknowledging territory shows recognition and respect for Aboriginal people. My family's history was as settlers to this land. I've lived my whole life in this wonderful province. I was raised on a mixed cattle and grain farm about an hour and a half north of Saskatchewan, neighboring the Atakakuk First Nation. And from that time, since I was small, I saw how the land provided us with food from our garden and from our crops. It gave shelter to our animals, and then of course there was tremendous power in the natural cycles of the earth. And I learned from a young age that as benefactors to this land, we have a responsibility to it. So with that sentiment, I try to carry it with me always, so I'm very grateful to acknowledge that we're here on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And speaking of reaffirming our relationships, this symposium is a time to come together. It is one piece of a larger national conference called the Together Ensemble that's an initiative of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network of Canada. The purpose of that organization is really to promote integrated approaches to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement, and through education, research, policy analysis, and global cooperation. So our first hour together today will be live streamed. So you'll have noticed cameras, and that's why we're on a little bit of a tight time schedule just for this first hour. We're going to have two wonderful keynote speakers this morning. Jean Andre and Gary Morasti on the live stream, and then the live stream will end promptly at 11, and then we can move into questions and answers and have a little bit more dialogue. At about 11:20, I will come back to the stage, and then we can talk about our next set of work together at the individual roundtables. Few housekeeping items before we begin. The washrooms are outside the door to the left along the hall. Please help yourself to refreshments if you haven't already. And if there were any kind of emergency in the building, our nearest exit is back straight out through those doors into the bowl. Also, I believe the Wi-Fi on campus may be down at the moment if any of you are trying to connect and wondering why it's not working. So apologies for that. I'm sure they're working to get it back up shortly. And I believe our live stream will be starting very shortly. I'll give just one little bit more welcome to the national audience. Excellent. Now that our national audience has joined us, I want to welcome you. I am Janelle Hutchinson, Chief Sustainability Officer here at the University of Saskatchewan. This session for the next hour is part of the Together Ensemble 2023 conference, Canada's national gathering on the Sustainable Development Goals. This year's conference runs over the course of 3 days, June 7th to 9th, in person at 5 sites across the country as well as online. It brings Canada's SDG community together across all sectors. We're pleased to be hosting this next session at the University of Saskatchewan campus as part of the broader national gathering. We welcome the rest of Canada into our event today and through this Ensemble Together Ensemble online broadcast. A full online conference program and broadcast schedule is available at www.togetherensemble.ca. So to ensure that we begin this session in a good way, I would like to welcome Elder Harvey Thunderchild from the Thunderchild Cree Nation. Thunderchild Cree Nation is within Treaty 6 territory and is a third-generation descendant of Chief Thunderchild. He was one of the signatories of the treaty in 1879. I presented Elder Thunderchild with a gift of tobacco and cloth earlier this morning, and I am very grateful that he can be here to join us.
Good morning. Thank you. Apet matre ni ngane hiwan. Ego mama egipe migusian, egipe tamagoan. Nantoga pixquin hiwan igan. Egipe goyan. Kai mesta moche ka pixquesta moche kai sinuak. Magamuston mamotama poka simon. Nswamna nagawitap mago mo instutage. Good morning. Everybody, acknowledge myself in Cree first, because that's one of the things that I was told by my grandparents, my uncles growing up, is always acknowledge people with your language first and foremost, because this is how we connect ourselves to our Creator and the things that we do. As Julian says, I'm Harvey Thunderchild. Wapastim Snehiawigasun, my Indian name is Wapastim, White Horse, and Achapi, meaning bow and arrow. Those were the names that were given to me when I was born by elders that raised me till I was about 5 years old. I grew up in Thunderchild First Nation. I was born in the bush. So being gone from Saskatchewan for over 25 years, I just came back. It's glad to be back. And I think, I've been with the university since 2019 in the College of Medicine. And it's been really, really gratifying, the things that I do and the people that I work with. I know Gary from the past that I worked with when I was with FSIN. And I see a couple of my friends at that table over there that I'm with, and I figured I'd be hiding from people, but people that I know start walking in. So I have to be honest now. No, I think the things that I do in my life, I'm the cultural coordinator for a first program of its kind, a department of its kind in any university is Vice Dean of Indigenous Health and Wellness, which was introduced on April 22nd as a department. I work for Dr. Janet Tutusis in that College of Medicine. And I think it's something that we're going to be looking at in the next number of years. I guess we have to start staffing our position and the things that we need to take a look at. What we're going to be looking at is some of the health issues that First Nations people are facing. Health disparities, how healthcare system works within Canada with First Nations people. It's a lot of work, and it's something that I'm looking forward to, the things that we do and carrying on. And I think it's an exciting time, not only for me, but for Janet also, Dr. Tutusis. And I'm kind of looking forward to the busy moments, I guess. And I've been involved with health for a majority of my life. Being a health director, as an administrator, looking after health issues with First Nations communities, of the issues that our First Nations people are facing, how healthcare system does for our people. And I think of the problematic issues of transportation, healthcare issues, lack of understanding of what our people are facing right now, especially our Indigenous communities when they go to their doctors. And no different from my mother. My mother's 93 years old. I just got off the phone with her just to make sure that she was okay. And one of the things that I usually do is when they go to the doctor, when they take her to the doctor, I need to find out from the doctor so I can explain things to her in the sense that she can understand my language of how she was treated and what the doctor's recommendations are. And these are hopefully these are some of the stuff that we'll be looking at in the next little while. But I do appreciate, I'm honored to be given the tobacco and the cloth. It's a protocols that we do. And I think of when we address events like this, when we're asked to open up. And I'm a very fluent Cree speaker. I've been off my community for 60 years, but never lost my language. And that's one of the things that my mother made sure, my brothers made sure that we didn't lose it. I lost two brothers to COVID. The first one was in 2020. He lived in Seattle when COVID first hit. He was the first Canadian that died from COVID. And my youngest brother, just a couple of years ago, and I'm sure you guys have heard of him, Victor Thunderchild from Prince Albert. He was a high school teacher for 29 years. One more year for retirement. He was looking forward to it, and he got hit by COVID. And the thing we talked about just a week before he passed away, because he usually visits me when he's in town. And one of the things that he talked about was making sure that his frontline workers were looked after to be vaccinated. He was the vice president of the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation in Saskatchewan. And as frontline workers that he spoke on behalf of the teachers of Saskatchewan. And it wasn't until the day after he passed away when Scott Moe decided to pass the vaccination policy to all frontline workers as teachers. A day too late, but it is what it is. But we do miss our brother. His daughter Rihanna just had a little boy here just a few months ago, 3 months premature, but they're doing great. And when I look at her and I look at my brother, because she's been showing pictures of her father, technology, technology, as if she's carrying her baby and her father's sitting right there, And I think I have 6 children of my own, 2 I raised, adopted, and my oldest one just graduated with anthropology just the other day. And I'm proud that all my kids have done well. I've got 2 lawyers, a finance guy who works for Affinity Credit Union here in town, and my kids are all across Canada, so they're all doing so well. So I don't worry about them, but they do worry about me sometimes when they call. They call and see if I'm still walking. Early this morning, everybody was calling me and they said, what are you doing today? So I told them that I was going to be here this morning. So with that, I think I'm going to say my prayers in the language that I know how, and people can join me if they want in the way you know how. And I will start with my prayer. Nanas komt no. Ha mamo utaimo. Ha kiman kapen na tamo totata. Kiman na ismam siwata kan tu tawya. Wotan suam na nagiwitab ma. Umakawiya muta ko. Tan sisi gis atus ko sigis nagatugi sigis abu kawicha signi hiyo. E kame sinta tamatan mamo utaimo. Kaktumagi toin. Eksumano tastemo. Go wepinas na amigo yan kapis questa macchian. Mamuta mo mate piani se iskaskita ene tataman. Nto ton swamna nakaipikska che ko ni chaga no takaipiska no seta Gary. Hakan to tonan. Hak tumagno na nista mamuta mo nista na apsisia. Maga atoskiwi no nista. Skapos epikska morgen swamna. Neona da kakiota. Estin tatamaan te pianista mamuta mo tumagitoin. Sa se tu gitang nakskatuna na kapag pikskatuna no. Estin tatamaan is iskaskitan mamuta mo. E kamate begam tu. Yung tatamaan. Am sa askitan ta nakskatuna na pikskatuna no. E accept mamuta mo. Te begam tu tau ya kakyo mo ta kapya. E oksama. Oh. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those moving and thoughtful words and helping us open this up in a very good way. Thank you so much. It's really my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker. My name is Maureen Reed, but I am here to introduce Dr. Jean Andre. And I have to tell you that a few years ago, I admit it was a few decades ago, I was so nervous because I was facing my PhD defense at the University of Waterloo. And I'd done a very small survey within a qualitative research study, and I was worried that someone was going to ask me if this survey was representative. I wasn't prepared to answer that question. And I was fussing and fretting when Jean dropped by, and she simply said, I can help. And she did. And I passed. Here I am. And Jean, I know I wasn't the first person that Jean helped, but I know that she's been helping students, faculty, senior administrators, and university partners learn together and work together ever since. Dr. Jean Andre was affectionately called Dean Jean until her retirement in 2022. She began contributing to the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo in the 1980s while pursuing her PhD there. Jean's research interests included determining the implications of climate change for transportation infrastructure and operations, as well as risk assessment and hazards. Her research made a significant contribution to the academic field, but also to public policy and transportation. She's also worked tirelessly for our National Association of Geographers and received the President's Award for Outstanding Leadership and Service to the Canadian Association of Geographers in 2016. Jean's intelligence and genuine interest in the success of others also led her to excellence as a teacher. She's taught statistics for over 20 years, and that's the class that students really love to hate, right? She taught it with style, humor, and she was awarded 3 different teaching awards in recognition of those efforts. I will tell you that indeed she received a marriage proposal from 2 of her students in a statistics class. So what are the odds, right? I bet Jean knows the answer to that. Under Jean's leadership as Dean of the Faculty of Environment at Waterloo, the faculty emerged as a national hub for environmental research, with research in climate action, sustainability solutions, flood adaptation, to name a few. With the firm belief that universities have an obligation to advance the aims of a sustainable future, in 2018, Jean launched the Pan-Canadian Network of Post-Secondary Institutions, SDSN, or Sustainable Development Solutions Network Canada, to facilitate learning and accelerate problem solving for sustainability and sustainable development. We gather here today largely because of her vision and her tenacity to realize it. Today she's going to reflect on some of the successes of the network and the job yet to be done. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jean Andre.
A bit more about that and the positionality before I go into the content of the talk. So I'm a fifth-generation Canadian, farm kid actually, and my ancestors came from southwestern Germany as farmers in the mid-1900s in order to settle land along the lower road in Ontario when the colony of Bruce was being opened to European settlers. And of course, in so doing, displacing the peoples who were of the Saugeen and Ojibwe nations. I'm calling it today from the Haldimand Tract, which is land promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River. And I've been involved in sustainability work for 3 decades now. And I was thinking yesterday when I was listening to the plenary session, one of the youth referred to those of us who aren't so youthful as experienced. And so I join you today as someone experienced with the SDGs, and I know most of you too have experience in at least one. I hope you'll indulge me. I'd like to show a few slides and take you for a couple of minutes just through the history of the SDGs from my perspective. So I'm just going to share the screen now. Let's see if I can do that. No, that's, yeah, okay, here we go. Okay, I'm hoping that is coming through to you. So my first slide, which looks at the sustainability movement, is intended to remind us that we've actually been on this journey since before 2015, in fact, much before. And even these slides only begin partway through the movement. Nevertheless, on the left, I begin with a picture that includes Maurice Strong on the left, in the front, riding the bicycle through Stockholm in 1972, when he was the Secretary General of the United Nations meeting on the human environment. And some people will say that this was a milestone. Others will say it was really the beginning of the global movement of sustainability. And a couple of the sentences from Maurice Strong's talk, I think, show you really about the sustainability thinking at that time, and it lines so nicely with our own. So just 2 sentences. The first, our purpose here is to reconcile humans' legitimate, immediate ambitions with the rights of others, with respect for all life-supporting systems, and with the rights of generations yet unborn. And then he goes on later and he says, we wish to advance not recklessly, ignorantly, selfishly, and perilously, as we have done in the past, but with greater understanding, wisdom, and vision. We are anxious, and rightly so, to eliminate poverty, hunger, disease, racial prejudice, and glaring economic inequalities between human beings. Now, many of you perhaps know Maurice Strong was born in Manitoba. He's a proud Canadian, and he played a lot of critical roles in the United Nations movement. In fact, he was a member of the commission that produced the second image, which is just to the right of the photo, and that's the 1987 report, Our Common Future. And in that report, the Brundtland Commission is often how we call it, the terms sustainable and unsustainable took on a clarity that I think has been built on since that time. And he was there at that time. He was also the first executive director of the United Nations Environment Program. Well, then we get to 2000. And by this time, the world is mobilizing in a fairly united way around developing regions. And So we have the Millennium Development Goals from 2000 to 2015, and you can see them listed as the 8: eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, and others. You'll also see at the bottom there's reference to one environmental sustainability goal, and then to the right of that, partnerships. Well, as we approached 2015, it was evident that not everything had yet been achieved. But in fact, some assessments of what was achieved during the time of the Millennium Development Goals is really very impressive. There had been acceleration even in that early period. In fact, the Brookings Institute did an assessment of the 6 human-centered goals and indicated in their work that between 20 and 60% of those ambitions had been achieved during the 2000 to 2015 period. As people from across this globe were working toward what would come from 2015 onward, they were also beginning to think of who could mobilize this. So the SDGs are the resultant product, and you see them on the right. Interestingly, and I think appropriately, we see that the themes that were under the Millennium Development Goal are carried through under society themes, and you'll see them there listed as hunger, health, poverty, and so forth. You'll also see other society themes added. Energy, cities, and institutions are the 3. You'll also see that the environment theme has been expanded. There are now 4 goals under the themes of water, climate, and land, and I've listed here as biosphere. But to this has been added economy themes: work, innovation, consumption, and inequalities. And so the SDGs has really taken on a much more holistic approach to development, a sustainable development. And of course, we all know there's intersectionalities and all kinds of targets that underneath each one. It's a massive, massive goal, one that we all need to put our shoulders to the wheel over. Well, under the theme of partnerships, one of the things that happened, and in fact, prior to the beginning of the 2015-30 agenda, was that the knowledge institutions were asked to get involved and to mobilize. And toward that end, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network was formed. Janelle very kindly at the introduction reminded us about what it is that the SDSN is about. And it's through education, research, policy analysis, and global cooperation that we'll attempt to achieve our mission. And that was launched in 2012, and it is the largest network of experts and scientists dedicated to the SDGs, with more than 1,800 members in 53 networks across 144 countries. And to the right, I show the image of Jeffrey Sachs when he visited the University of Waterloo for the launch of SDSN Canada in 2018. And I particularly like this image because, well, for one, Jeffrey Sachs is a very inspirational leader, just an enormous champion of the movement. But for 2, he's wearing a University of Waterloo tie. And how that came to be is he happened to come to university and had left his carry bag behind. So he arrived with only the clothes on his back. So we scrambled to get him a jacket from one of my colleagues and a University of Waterloo tie. Now, the SDSN mission identifies how we should go about things. And Maureen asked me if I could identify ways in which we've been accelerating the SDGs. And I'm going to do that. But I wanted to frame it around what I think knowledge institutions are for. And that includes universities, but also colleges and think tanks. And I really like the framing that's given by Manuel Castells in an article that is now published in the book Castells in Africa, but which was originally an address in 2009 that he gave in South Africa. And in that, he talks about the dynamic and contradictory functions of universities. I want to talk about 3 today. Each of them is listed. They relate to ideology, production of knowledge, and training. And I'll deal with each one now. And for each of these 3, I'll talk about 3 examples of accelerations in the context of SDSN. So in the beginning, universities were primarily ideological. And they took on the role of transmitting the values that help legitimize the social order. You know, in the early days, while some universities were self-organized as guilds, for the most part, the teaching profession has had their salaries paid for by the government or by the church. And insofar as that's true, Western or theological values or imperial values have been embedded within these institutions from early days. I think you could also argue that today contemporary universities also reinforce the social order. For example, in their way that they focus on innovation and discovery for capitalism. But I think we can also say that sometimes universities, in being ideological, challenge the value system. And that's what I think is happening around the SDGs. So 3 examples of acceleration. The first one that I think is absolutely critical is creating awareness of the SDGs in tomorrow's leaders. This is done particularly through SDSN Youth. The SDSN Youth Group was also created in 2015 with the start of the agenda, and it is mobilizing youth from across 127 countries with programming that's engaging tens of thousands of young people. In Canada, we have also SDSN Youth. It was launched in 2018. We have 16 hubs with 400 youth members engaging again with thousands of youth on all of the various campuses in which they're involved. This is absolutely critical. This is the energy that will drive the SDGs forward as we head into the future. The second example that actually touches me most closely is evolving the value system of knowledge institutions. And we see this in particular in strategic plans. If you look at the university and college and think tank strategic plans 10 years ago, you will see very little mention of sustainability. I know that's particularly true in the university sector. In fact, when I became a dean in 2014, I was advocating that sustainability should be adopted in our plan as a university core value. But that in fact wasn't done, and it wasn't until our 2020 plan when that became core. And what has happened since then is actually quite magical. We see much more serious engagement on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We see a focus on equity, diversity, inclusion. We see a focus on anti-racism. We see a focus on decarbonizing. And all of this stems from the fact that the institutions themselves are evolving their value system. I think to some extent, we're also helping evolve the value system of society by taking on the role of convener, such as, for example, today, or by localizing and training those things that we've come to understand as experts in a field. The second role that Castells talks about that I want to mention here is the research university. Now, research universities emerged in the 1800s with a focus on science and its application, particularly through engineering. Of course, other scholarly traditions have long been part of the university system, the humanities, the social sciences, and increasingly we see universities embracing other ways of knowing. In many respects, because the universities have embraced research for such a long time, I would argue that the research machine is moving very, very strongly in most universities in Canada and indeed across the globe. And so I think when we ask what is the role of SDSN, it's reasonable to say that perhaps SDSN should, and I think in fact it has, been trying to be complementary rather than to duplicate the kinds of work that are already underway through the various granting councils and the expansion of graduate studies and through human curiosity. 3 examples, though, I think of how we're accelerating. One is through responsive research. So an example is the work that was done on the Lancet Commission related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this was co-chaired by Jeffrey Sachs of SDSN Global. And this is an example of pulling together people from across the globe in order to dive deeply into an issue that's of critical importance for the globe. We also see that a lot of really good work that's been done under the SDSN umbrella is related to pathways to sustainability. And the key here is that it's important to demonstrate to the world with rigor that it is possible to achieve sustainability, to do a backcasting from that state to what it is that we need to do now. And so a lot of the earlier work that was done by SDSN with IATSE and some of the other modeling centers of the world do that exactly. Some of the work that's going on in individual countries that are focusing on a particular sector. For example, Bolivia is focusing on tourism, and Mexico and Philippines on food. And a third area is through monitoring and motivating. And yesterday in the AI session, we heard lots of calls to say that measuring matters because it motivates. And the annual report that is produced by SDSN Global is shown here, but we see examples now increasingly of things being done on smaller spatial units in order to mobilize resources at the municipal and the local level. Okay, the third role that universities play, and other knowledge institutions as well, is through training the labor force through professionalization of degrees. And that includes, for example, law and engineering and medicine, accounting and planning and all kinds of things. And it's very exciting to see what is happening. You know, my friends across the academy, regardless of their professional orientation, tell me that increasingly their organizations are adopting sustainability as core in their curriculum. There's lots of questions still about the extent to which we can squeeze yet more into some of these tightly scripted programs, but it's happening and the will is there. We also see new academic programs that are inherently interdisciplinary and focused on sustainability. And I think your own example there with the School of Environment and Sustainability is a really good example. Another way in which as the SDGs are being accelerated within the academic community is by creating resources that are truly available to the globe, to all of the SDSN members across the world. And I really love the SDG Academy work. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, it's really amazing. Some incredible films and other products. And there's also a global schools program for the primary to secondary school level. And then third, there are things happening nationally and locally. Nigeria is a fantastic example where in the tertiary, the secondary, and the primary schools, curriculum is integrating sustainability, often with the help, of course, of the sustainability experts, often in these knowledge institutions. Canada is also working on a university community of practice for sustainability education. And yesterday, I know that Minister Gould talked about other things that were happening. So I'll just end by saying a couple of things, and that is that I think we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we will be tomorrow? Will the universities continue to evolve, and how will they evolve? And how should they evolve, in particular around this issue of values? Things are happening, it's fantastic, but the knowledge sector itself perhaps needs to reflect a little bit more deeply on what it is they're here for and what it is that society needs of them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you for helping us think a little bit more deeply about what universities can and should be doing to advance the SDGs, and hoping that you'll be able to stay on for some of the Q&A that we'll have following our next guest speaker. So I think I have to tell you a secret. Mr. Gary Morasti is younger than me, and he has his own Wikipedia page. I thought that was for people who lived like a long time ago, but I was wrong. I realized it's actually for people who have truly made an impact. So Gary Morasti is a former two-time Grand Chief of the Prince Albert Grand Council and a member of the Peter Ballantine Cree Nation located in Treaty 6 territory. He is the first statist First Nations person to be elected in Saskatchewan. In the early 2000s, he served as a member of Parliament for Desnethe, Missinippi, Churchill River in northern Saskatchewan. And he is an undergraduate and a graduate in education from the University of Saskatchewan. To say something about his unfailing commitments to both Indigenous and settler people in Canada, Gary introduced the motion for the federal government to offer a formal apology to survivors of the Canadian residential school system. This motion was worked on 3 different times, but finally received unanimous all-party support in the House of Commons. Can you imagine that today? Anyway, his efforts led to the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and a deep reckoning by settler Canadians about the harms of past and present colonization throughout society and the steps we might all take to become partners in reconciliation. Gary has also served on countless boards providing both education and economic development opportunities for Indigenous people in Saskatchewan and Canada. For his outstanding service to the people of Canada, Gary's received both the Queen Elizabeth II Golden Jubilee Medal in 2004, and for his service to the people of Saskatchewan, the Commemorative Medal for the Centennial of Saskatchewan in 2005. And he's been working ever since. Since being a federal politician, he's served with several private companies, always seeking opportunities for reconciliation through fair and sustainable economic development and through education. Presently, Gary serves as the CEO of the Peter Ballantine Group of Companies and as Senior Advisor, Indigenous and External Relations for the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan. We are honored to welcome Gary Morasti to our event today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jean, for the comments just now. Learned a lot even through that, getting more background. Thank you, Elder Harvey, for your opening prayer this morning. And he mentioned his brother, Victor. Victor and I were very good friends. We went to university together years ago, and sorry, I got to put this on here properly while I'm talking. And he was an amazing individual, you know, as Harvey shared. So, but with that, excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and actually look forward to learning from all of you later on this morning as we kind of go through the table. I'm turning on my timer here because I'm a recovering politician. I think I'm on step 9 of the 12-step program, so this may take a little longer. But with that, yeah, no, big thank you to everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I acknowledge the flags that are here with us, with the Métis Nation, Treaty 6 flag, the provincial Canadian, and the university flag. I acknowledge, you know, where we're at in this time and in this place, and yeah, looking forward to seeing what kind of damage I can do with you guys this morning. It's interesting because as I prepared for this, and I've kind of stepped away from public speaking and just kind of laid low the last few years, focusing on different things. COVID kind of did that to all of us, but I kind of ran into some blocks, and I couldn't, for the life of me, envision how to approach this subject. It's usually I'm very visual, and I start with a chart. And I usually have slides, but usually in sessions like this, I always worry about the technology. So I thought, okay, this time I'm not going to do slides, but very visual. And I usually start with a circle in the middle, then I branch out, and I usually just then wing it after that and speak. And very rarely do I have an actual thing that I've written. So I'm actually nervous because I suck at reading stuff, right? So, but I thought, but I did run into a bit of a brick wall. I was thinking, like, well, how hard could this be? You know, kind of belittling myself, but we're just talking about the SDGs, ESG frameworks, the economy, business, science, innovation, technology, public policy, it's all easy topics that, especially when you can all kind of lump them together. So I was a little intimidated, to say the least, but in having a conversation with Maureen, with Greg, you know, as we were talking about this, you know, is focus on Saskatchewan, focus on the North, focus on Indigenous. We really like to see, you know, what your thoughts are in that space. And so after sitting down unsuccessfully a couple times trying to craft something, got up and walked away and started thinking in Cree to myself, Tansi tugo ay sawapata wo SDGs utiet nigan. Tansi tugo ay sawapata wo kaya tiagis padik. Tansit tuigis na no isiginawa meguawo. Like just asking question like, how do they see SDGs in the future? How has it evolved from the past? Where are we at today? How do they see us within that? And I think through, walking around, doing some other stuff around the house and talking Cree, reflecting a bit on my career as well, education, public service, politics, business, all of which had elements of global and local within them. Then I started to focus a bit more on northern Saskatchewan, our Indigenous communities, all communities, the North. And I think through the process of thinking out loud in my head, maybe even talking, my wife was probably wondering, why are you walking around talking in Cree in the house by yourself? But through the process of thinking in Cree, thinking about place, I think a few thoughts started to emerge for me. So first, and I think backed by reality, is the fact I take a bit more of a pragmatic view of these things, but from an Indigenous perspective, failure in achieving these goals is life and death. I am not even exaggerating. People are dying in our communities every day. They died yesterday, dying today, and they're dying tomorrow. A failure to achieve these types of goals that have been set out are literally life and death for us. And sometimes perhaps we don't think about that, but it certainly is true from where I was raised, nurtured, and shaped in these communities. So looking back, and I go back to my just growing up and stuff, we've been trying to advance common sense solutions to address a lot of the issues and challenges in our communities for decades. We've battled apathy, partisanship, ignorance, systemic racism, and others talked about solutions about our backyard without really involving us, right? So why do I say all this? So it's life and death because today, right now, we're seeing forest fires ravage the northern Canada. I just started reading, I don't know if you guys have started to read, I just started reading, I haven't finished it, but it's scary. John Vallant's book, Fire Weather. Interesting, it talks about forest fires. And I was 15 years old when I first went forest firefighting. They thought I was 16, I didn't correct them because I wanted to make some money. But I was scared the minute that plane landed on the Churchill River and the forest fire's right there and you could feel the heat and they said, get out. And you got your water pack and your clothes and you're wet because you're jumping in the river and right away you're fighting fire. The intensity of the fires today, the fire tornadoes he talks about, the heat, it's just unbelievable. The peat moss as it dries, fires are staying for months after the surface fire has been out, right? Firefighters are on the front lines every day risking their lives. Evacuations are common in our communities. The disruption and the trauma of that to families, the disconnection and interruption of education and health services are real. And just a quick forest fire. I know I have limited time, but one time we were out firefighting and my fire boss was my uncle who had raised me. And he said, okay, in Cree, drop the hoses and run. So I kind of, I'm just kind of going like this. I'm 15 years old. My uncle, who's 60, is lapped me, and he's hurdling fallen trees. And I thought, oh my God, this must be serious. So I had to pick up my pace to keep up with him. But it's real. The danger is real when you're forest firefighting. And one other, because of the intense heat, we evacuated our community in 1980, and we were standing on a ridge because we couldn't do anything about the fire, and we saw it coming into view, and we were up high on a ridge. The fire preheated the trees in front of it. It rose up to the top, the treetops, and it rolled like 30 kilometers an hour, just going from west to east or east to west. It's unbelievable, the power, right? So community evacuations all too common. Floods are displacing our communities across the country. Droughts, low water levels impact water access, water quality, mobility of our people on their waterways, and impacts local economic pursuits. Energy access is tenuous for us in the north. The northern grid's not grounded. Access to I just realized the other day, I was talking to people from back home, they can't even get propane to enjoy a barbecue. They have to go from Pelican, for example, to PA to get propane. So to have a barbecue, you have to plan what we take for granted here. So access to even basic energy for quality of life, enjoyment, sitting on your deck is an everyday challenge. Food security is a constant challenge for us with inflation, prices, freshness, quality, variety, access to grocery stores. Unfortunately, kids do go to sleep hungry in many cases. Extreme weather events such as plow winds and tornadoes becoming all too common in the north, and they're moving even further north. The heat dome in BC killed 600 people. Think about our communities in the north: inadequate housing, not properly insulated, an unstable energy grid, and the heat dome come in, no cooling capacity for our houses. It's only a matter of time before, we kind of see what happened in BC and some of our northern communities. Hunting, fishing, harvesting are all, on the verge of extinction potentially because the land is changing so drastically. Of course, road access, connectivity are all challenges. Listen, I haven't even talked about, and I didn't mean to get all real, I haven't talked about poverty, mental health crisis, inadequate housing, which are persistent challenges as well. Now, unfortunately, and this is where we get to some of the meat in the sandwich here, is that these conditions are made worse by various other factors. Northern alienation. It's real, right? Provincial norths in Canada are in a constant political limbo. They're the first to get funding cuts. They're considered later in the process to receive any benefits, typically an afterthought, and the debates between the feds and the province about who's responsible for northern infrastructure and so on and so forth. And these are real challenges across Canada's norths, right? Most of the populations in Canada live within an hour or so of the US borders, and they benefit from the bounty of the north, but very little is reinvested back north. If there's real and tangible impacts and progress with SDG goals, it's probably those Canadians living closest to the US border that feel it. We don't. Even Saskatchewan, be tough for us to argue we feel the progress. There's obviously some, but the further north you go, you're removed. But yet we're the first to feel it. And we were having breakfast this morning, and we're talking about, yeah, we feel it, we see it every day, right? So northern alienation is real. 2, Indigenous peoples, northern peoples generally confronted with a unique public policy challenge comprised of 3 things. Geographic marginalization, small population over a wide geographic area. 2, demographic conflict. Average age of our people are under the age of 22. Canadians are over the age of 45. So knee and hip replacements in the majority is more of a topic than early childhood health, just to give an example. So I had this conflicting public policy issues, right? And I've been in a room as a politician with bureaucrats and other politicians say, well, it's too expensive. And it makes sense. Too expensive to build that infrastructure, education, and this and that and the other thing, housing, all this in the north for such a small population. It's true. It's not cheap. It's real. And also, we have this demographic challenge. And who do you vote for? By the way, like if you voted the right, maybe you'd get, so sometimes you can get pretty basic, pretty grinding, those conversations. And then you add to the public policy challenge, if you have the geographic marginalization, the demographic, then you have the jurisdictional chaos. Who's responsible for First Nation Métis issues? What's the degree of separation and responsibility for the feds and the province, right? It's like a hot potato or a game of cornhole. You're trying to get that bag in the hole and it disappears and out of sight, out of mind, or a hot potato throwing it around. So the jurisdictional chaos is real, and that's the big second. So you have northern alienation, this unique public policy challenge. And then 3, which is extremely troubling and scary right now, is our global society is more polarized than ever, in all likelihood, right? So it's really quite sad. It's so divisive and polarized on a daily basis. I don't know if you guys subscribe to the Edelman Trust Barometer that talks about trust levels in Canada, the US, and different countries. and scary, really scary what's going on. So, and as Indigenous peoples, unfortunately, we're often the targets of that polarized rhetoric centered around race, ignorance, gaslighting of macro aggressions. Just look at the recommendations in missing and murdered Indigenous women, the TRC recommendations, Colton Bushy, what happened in Saskatchewan. So these are real, and if it's getting worse, I'm really worried about that, right? If it wasn't already bad and it's getting worse. So polarization has this ability to make all of those things I talked about previously even worse and tough. So you have this unique convergence of northern alienation, western alienation, and polarization, Indigenous alienation, coming together to make it tough for us who are living every day. So I paint a bit of that because it really is life and death, right? And these objectives and these goals are so critical to achieve and move forward on. And solutions exist, but the economic realities can be difficult to overcome, and political will is sometimes lacking or not necessarily smart. I remember when the SDG goals came about, pre-2015, and I thought at the time that the strategy kind of was holistic in its approach, circular in the recommendation, kind of reflective of Indigenous and tribal world views, and I thought they were thoughtful, comprehensive, and probably achievable. Over the years, as I did work around sustainable development reporting with various companies utilizing various ESG frameworks, I became a little concerned. I was observing a clear disconnect between the SDG goals, ESG reporting frameworks, and business in general. Not to be cynical, but I felt a bit like the pursuit of SDG and ESG goals were too checkbox driven. We were chasing scores, right? And the framing of ESG strategies were, how can we get the highest score with the least amount of investment? And we were kind of driven in two ways. Maybe consultants would come to us and say, if you pay us, we'll help you get a higher score, which kind of can be demotivating, right? I'm being a little harsh, right? But also the low cost and lowest hanging fruit trend kind of took hold for the first number of years or decade as we achieved these goals. So obviously, these had an impact on the sustainability and the ability to transform society. But we did see some immediate goals, and they were exciting for the first number of years, right? We've seen the May 2023 SDG report card. We were a little concerned of the progress, but man, we were humming along the first number of years. But the rubber started to hit the road once more costly measures hit the boardroom tables and cabinet tables. And so it became tougher. Progress slowed if it didn't stall completely. And I'm not sure if these successes have reached the north, as I've mentioned earlier, but if there are any clear, measurable achievement and progress towards these goals, they're usually probably in Toronto or Vancouver, unfortunately. So maybe a part of this is because the SDGs, as I mentioned before, I thought holistic, circular, and I think they are, represented a new paradigm thinking in the interplay between those goals and our traditional Western economy. I think Canadian views on business are deeply embedded around Western concepts of wealth and capitalism. And I work in that space, and and so you see it, but it has some downfalls, right? It has some challenges. Concept of land is to be exploited, profit is king, accumulation of the wealth is key, concentration of that wealth is desired, wage labor is a commodity, supply and demand, and so on. So to achieve the SDG goals, it probably requires a deeper focus and a paradigm shift around how we transition our economy. I'm generalizing here a bit, but if you ask Indigenous people about what wealth and capitalism is about, I think the answer revolves around good health, well-being, connection to land and place. We love profits when we have businesses. I'm head of a big group of companies and that, right? but there's tweaks and there's a worldview change a bit that probably needs to happen. So, and I know a lot of bright minds in the world went into thinking about the transition from a high carbon to low carbon world. I'm sure those great minds also thought about how, quality of life can be aided by improvements to technology and innovation and rolling it out. I sit on the board of the IRPP, Institute of Research of Public Policy, and we met in Calgary the other day. And one of our talks is the post-election budget, or post-election in Alberta. And it was interesting because there's lessons learned for the coming Saskatchewan election in all likelihood, in that the election hardly talked about sustainability. It was about affordability. And this is what I talk about, the rubber hitting the road with this paradigm shift that's not keeping up to what we need to see happen. Now, it was interesting. I didn't realize, but the Alberta government, they need $77 a barrel oil to break even in their provincial budget. Oil's at 75, I think, right now. Previous government had 60 bucks a barrel, and they were going on the decline and focusing. But a $1 change on a barrel of oil in Alberta is $633 million to the provincial coffers. So you have this dispute between the federal government and Alberta, and it's really hitting the road around budget time, right? And how do we get around that, and can we? And what would that look like? Because their comment was, we have the biggest rollout. I think, there's experts in the room, Alberta has one of the biggest rollouts of solar in the country, but the impact of solar as an energy generator versus oil, so they're having some interesting conversations. So even though it wasn't top of mind during the election, affordability was, it's come roaring back because their budget, they could be in major trouble if the oil doesn't hit 77 a barrel and it drops, right? So big risks over there. Anyway, I digress for a bit. The question now is, how do we deal with this today? We're halfway through to 2020, and the report card says we've got some work to do. I think leading up to 2015, the world was such a different place, right? And it's a lot more turbulent within our society, our global society today. Pandemic futures, global conflicts, deglobalization of supply chains, domestication of those supply chains, polarization. And my timer just ran out at 20 minutes. So what do we do? And I don't think there's an easy answer. I certainly don't have it. There's way smarter people everywhere, but I think there's some clear questions. Do we keep the same approach and just double down? Has pointing the finger at the laggards and trying to embarrass them worked? And will that continue to work? Will keeping the same approach work in the context of fake news era? How will societal polarization impact the goals when there's these other priorities emerging? How will global conflict affect our goals? Do we stay the course with no change and just kind of hope for the best? How does the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act impact Canada? That's, if you're unfamiliar, it's massive, right? I also sit on the board of Sustainable Development Technologies Canada. So trying to be putting Canada at the forefront of technology and innovation. And there's amazing work out there. It's just not commercialized and moving quicker. And this interplay between the economy and commercializing these technologies that can really have an impact on the goals is just not happening quick enough. So what needs to happen in that space? The interplay, I won't even say that because I just mentioned, but the interplay between, innovation, technology, and quality of life, just to give you one example. There is a technology out there, and there's many, this is one small example, teleoptical. You can have somebody here sitting in Saskatoon doing a full-blown optical examination of a patient in Black Lake, highest resolution, where you can tell not only is their eyesight in trouble, but you can begin to pick up high blood pressure, diabetes, a whole range of health issues just through a really comprehensive optical exam. We can do that without flying them in, without spending a lot of resources, getting access to quality health care. But government policy will not pay for that service today, right? So rolling those out, those technologies faster is absolutely key. So as I wrap up here, I'm going to make a controversial statement. It's always bad to say that and flag it ahead of time, but this is something that was shared with me by somebody who's a huge SDG champion, ESG champion. Several of them, in fact, as am I. Despite what you may be hearing so far, just like I said, it's life and death, right? He said to me, or they said to me, does the pursuit of SDGs, but more specifically the pursuit of a low-carbon economy, do more to hurt Indigenous, lower-income and northern populations today? And I was stumped. And then the conversation went on. Today, energy is costly due to being choked at the supply. It's too expensive to have islanded renewable energy systems in the north and invest in them. Transmission lines are super expensive. Inflation is rampant. Innovation is slow in rolling out. All this raises the cost of living for our people in our Indigenous communities and northern communities. It's perhaps accelerating poverty and impacting quality of life right now while we're struggling to achieve these goals. Now, I don't think we can roll back the energy transition, the technology and innovation work that's been done. If anything, it's telling us we need to act with more urgency, right? So I think some key observations from a non-expert is that the role of business in advancing these goals is more outside today than it ever was. I think collaboration is non-negotiable. Saskatchewan, the federal government, Alberta, need to focus on pragmatic solutions to these challenges. They're all right to a certain extent. They're all wrong to a certain extent. You need to get over it and talk more, collaborate more. I can tell you, below the political level, it's actually happening. There's a lot of innovative thinking, so it kind of excites me when you start to hear the actual behind the political rhetoric, some of the real work that's going on. So I think role of business is outside in the transition of the economy, accelerating the rollout of technology. Collaboration, like I said, is non-negotiable. And as I mentioned, unfortunately, it's really life and death for our communities, and not being involved and talking about solutions without us is extremely problematic, right? And I think that there are a lot of solutions coming from the north, from Indigenous people, from northern peoples, is extremely valuable, and they're there, but we do run up to some of these barriers that I talked about. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gary. Again, lots of things to think about in terms of, really practical kinds of ideas, and some of those are, in a sense, not new ideas. Like working together might be a good one, right? And so thank you so much, both for two wonderful pieces of inspiration for us. We have a little bit of time, so the live stream, I think, has ended at this point, and we have a little bit of time to be able to ask questions of each of the speakers. And because of some of the technical things, I'll ask that people from the floor, if you stand up and speak loudly, I will repeat those questions so that Jean is able to hear. Are you able to see Jean at this?
No, we're not able to see her now. We can, when she's answering, she'll be coming up on screen.
Okay. So Jean, can you hear me?
Yes.
She said yes? Okay. Yes. All right. There's also a chair back here. Gary, do you want to sit?
Play piano?
Yes, absolutely. Or you're welcome to sit down if you want to sit, or you're welcome to stand, whichever feels. But feel free to move the chair so that we can all see you as well. I just didn't want you to have to stand up. Okay, if that's, yeah. So anybody got any questions for the speakers? Yes.
I'll just tied to Gary's closing statement there. So, and I'll maybe throw out a comment at the start, and then I'll just tack a question onto it. So, I think the biggest issue with working through some of the sustainable development goals, particularly from a utility perspective, that's where I can best speak from, is to build capacity in both parties. And I'll maybe just state what I mean by that. So, I think it's difficult for some of the remote Indigenous communities to understand utility economics, utility politics, all that kind of thing. And I think from the utilities perspective, so from the executive perspective, I think there's a bit of a big brother approach is step aside, we'll help you fix your problem without really fully understanding what it is. So I think that's where the key is. And to Gary's perspective on whether it helps or hurts the communities, that was always one of my concerns. I'm a former CEO of Northwest Territories Power Plant. So what I observed there is many of the communities wanted clean energy sources. So absolutely, it's something we all need to do. But where many communities struggle is the impact on rates. So what I think from a utility perspective, the equation, the way the utility operates is very simple. There's a pile of capital costs that get depreciated. There's a pile of operating costs. So when you add new infrastructure, it drives rates up. And that was, I think, where the communities struggled. But I'll say from the utility perspective, where the utility struggled was how dire the situation was, how the community was living with the noise pollution of the plant right in the community, the emissions that came out of that plant, etc. So if I come full circle, I'd ask Gary just to comment what his thoughts are. But to me, it seems like there's capacity development required both in the community and with the utilities. Is that? What are your thoughts?
Can I just repeat for Jean, and then Gary, you can answer. So Jean, the observation was that it seemed that there's a need to build mutual capacity for communities and utilities in developing renewable energy, and it's not just one or the other. So I think this mic is live.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question, Noel. I think it's real. The challenge is real. I think there can be a capacity gap. I don't know if it's centered around understanding. I think it's centered perhaps a bit about structure, around what profitability looks like, what it means, about being able to leverage some of the capital that's needed to be a real equity participant potentially, right? And so I think it's layered. I think the communities understand that very well. I think the challenge is the business models, which are real. Like there's cost, there's depreciation of assets, right? Those are real. And I think, I've been involved in some discussions where there were paths forward. It took risk of a partner to think about things differently. And I think, I can't get into detail, but there were pathways to actually get around that. I think the capacity is actually pretty strong out there, and the understanding is pretty robust. Sometimes we still do talk around each other a bit, and I think that's maybe part of the problem, but there are solutions out there, and there are some examples, I think. But it does require being bold, taking some risk, and having authentic conversations along the way, right? So.
Thank you.
I was going to ask you where you got your hair cut, but you told me that already this morning. No, Gary, one of the things you've always challenged us to think about over the years is this kind of a cycle when you talk about when people conflate like the culture of the people with the culture of poverty, and this kind of deficit thinking approach with, especially in government, but not just there. So how do we break that thinking?
So what Greg's talking about, my wife is the one I stole these ideas from. She was working with the Maori people on education, and they talked about this pathologizing cycle. Most Canadians' understanding of Indigenous people is pretty slim. Like they just skim that. It's not taught in schools, especially our generation, even though when I went K-12 on reserve, we didn't learn about our history, we learned about the Renaissance, we learned about a whole bunch of other things, right? So, no fault of their own, except bad public policy, not a lot of Canadians truly understand Canadian history. Like little things like highest rate of enlistment in the World War efforts from Indigenous communities. A lot of people know that, right? And I can go on. But because there's this skimming understanding, and when they do visit a community, they may see some poverty, they may see some addiction, they may see some housing that's not up to standard, and so on and so forth. And because they have just a brief understanding of our communities, it sticks with them because that's not what they see when they get back to Saskatchewan or Winnipeg or whatever. They get back to their office, and maybe they know they have to work with that community. They get back to the office and they read reports and that, and it justifies what they just saw. Highest rates of this, lowest rates of that. Numerous publications, right? Well, what they're doing is they're beginning to confuse the culture of poverty with the culture of the people. Poverty doesn't discriminate no matter where you're at in the world. And what they see there is poverty, not the people, not the culture of the people. They don't really get to know us through that brief visit, their background understanding, and then reading a report. So they have this confusion. Then, so you move from this skim to this justifying with seeing it in books and reports, then they move to prediction. Well, based on what I saw, what I read, I think Indigenous people cannot be engineers, cannot be nurses, they can't be this, that, and the other thing. And then they prescribe that, and this is a pathologizing cycle. It deficit theorizes the community of it. But the big weakness in that whole thing is never get to know the community well enough to hear the solutions and to hear the opportunities and dreams and the aspirations and stuff, right? And that's how you break it, is to take the time to actually hear the dreams, the vision, the aspirations of the people, get to know them. Don't get confused with what you're seeing, which is poverty, the culture of poverty, versus what the people really are all about, right? So.
Any other questions coming from the field?
I guess I can allude to some of the stuff that Gary was talking about. And I think of being in the department where I'm at today, and even with the ones before with Chemical Chair of Indigenous Health and Wellness, on research on HIV, AIDS, Hep C. When you go to communities, like Gary said, you have to understand the community first before you can start doing something. It's more than a tobacco, it's more than a blanket, it's more than the honorarium that you want to give to the community to extract something from what you want. As researchers, you have to be cognizant, you have to be respectful. You have to understand who they are first. They're rich in their lives, but we see poverty, like Gary said, we see poverty from the outside when we look in. We see the conditions of the housing, the living environments. But sometimes we don't see the real people on the inside. They're rich in the way of their traditional culture and how they live with the land. But we see something within our eyes, we see poverty. We judge what we see sometimes. And sometimes that's just not it. And I think of working in that department before, you have to get to know the people first. Don't question them about what you're there for. Don't intimidate them because they'll close right away. Understand them first before you can understand the real core issues, what they have in their communities. And I think that's one of the things that I've always said to all the people that I work with Indigenous people. Understand them first. Don't just go in there with a little bit of gift to extract something for your gain. Thank you.
Thank you. Jean, I'm wondering if you have any sort of thoughts or observations about how the university is responding to the call to become more aware, either through curriculum, through whether it's hiring practices, through the kinds of pedagogy that we offer to address and or conduct our research practices to become real partners with Indigenous peoples in reconciliation. I think that's something that, you know, when Gary, when you said that, you know, we learned virtually nothing. And I know in my own public education that I learned virtually nothing about Indigenous peoples. I did know that there was a place called, Musqueam, which was on the, considered to be the outskirts of Vancouver at that time where I was living. But I think, and it's interesting because my son said to me, I don't know why I have to learn more about some of these issues because we're now learning these things at a very young age. And I don't know from the public school system how true that is, but I do see that there's an enormous shift in terms of at least attempts, but I think we're just at the very beginning of that road. I don't know if others who are more immersed in education and education development, whether you might have some more specific observations about that. Vicky, Dawn, thoughts? Yeah, I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, I would suggest to you that yes, there's been big shifts. But I would also agree with Gary that polarization is infiltrating public education similarly, right? And you see that push and pull and whether or not trade education is going to be new curricula in some provinces. Saskatchewan is still pretty pro-trade education and the incorporation of elders into schools. Active education is growing, language programs are growing, right? But I think there's a real concern right now about the pushback to that and what will happen. And we do see in COVID, during COVID, for example, a greater loss of Indigenous children not returning to school, access issues in the north to online learning possibilities. So all these things are exacerbated. Gary has mentioned. So I think there's attempts to be doing work, but we're always brought into the push-pull and politics.
Thank you. I think we have time just for one more question or observation.
I was just going to comment on your question to that. I work at Gabriel Dumont Institute. I work in the Culture and Heritage Department. I find that, as has been mentioned, it is super important. The engagement piece, the collaborative piece, and the partnership piece is extremely important. But what we're finding, especially at GDI, is the fatigue. It's the expectation that we can be all and give all that we are all the time to everyone else. And despite the fact that we try to help and educate our communities so much, there's also this large expectation that we help everybody, because the broader understanding of education piece is extremely important across for all Canadians. But we're finding ourselves, fatigued and strained because of the lack of capacity, because of the lack of money and supports and funding, and so we just can't be all for everybody, despite the fact that we really want to. So I think that that's an important aspect.
And that everybody needs to participate in the work, not just.
Is this yours or am I taking it back?
Thank you very much, and thank you again to both of our guest speakers who've given us a lot to think about and some sort of fodder, I think, to stimulate our discussions as we move forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Janelle, who's going to talk about that.
All right, so our live stream has ended. Give a bit of a sigh of relief. We're going to move into the Saskatchewan-only portion of our day together. I want to thank Jean and Gary, echoing Maureen's comments, for a great way to start us off and really get us thinking as we start to move into the table work. Also, I want to take a few moments, now that we're not on such a tight time schedule, to just officially welcome everyone. It's an exciting week here at the university. It is Convocation Week, and so we're celebrating all of the graduates. And our president, Peter Stoichev, was delighted when I shared the invitation list with him, and he absolutely would have been here had he not been over at Merlis Belcher with our graduates today. I'm also really grateful that you have chosen to spend time with us, and I really want to hear and learn from all of the different people in this room. We have community partners, Indigenous leaders, government representatives, we have our Vice President of Administration, and several Associate Vice Presidents. And I believe we even have 2 international guests here today from Alaska and Sweden. They're both at table 7, so welcome to everyone. I'll give a little bit more context for our work for the rest of the day. There's really two purposes. We've learned a little bit more about SDSN Canada today, and one of their roles, Jean mentioned this a bit, is to gather feedback. So they're looking for feedback, actions, ideas, and recommendations with a particular focus on reporting about the progress and the acceleration, what's needed for accelerating the SDGs within Canada. There's going to be a lot of attention on the SDGs this year. This was mentioned. I mean, we're halfway to the 2030 goal, and the timing in June, having this right now, was because there's going to be several high-level conversations happening over the next few months. There's the high-level political forum happening, and then an SDG, the summit on the SDGs happening in September. So the Government of Canada will be really pulling together different feedback as they submit a voluntary national review this summer about progress to date. So that is one of our main purposes here today. So I also want to mention that there will be note takers at each of your tables. They are University of Saskatchewan students, and their job is to capture any recommendations or next steps that your table, your group wants to put forward. But I want to be very clear, like nothing will be written down verbatim. It's not going to be attributed to any one or any organization unless you specifically wanted it to be. And I mean, we're really looking to create that atmosphere for thoughtful dialogue. So I'm asking everyone to please enter the conversations in that spirit. I will also let the groups know when we're nearing the end of that portion, so it'll be around 2 o'clock, and I'm probably going to suggest that the note takers read back to you their action items, or try to make sure that they've accurately gathered the themes or the things that have been discussed. Again, if at the end of that anyone has any concerns, or again, I know a lot of you are representing organizations, if you have any concerns, please just let me know and we will find a solution. I also want to extend an extra special welcome to the USask students in the room today. I've spoken with a few of them, and they are just delighted to be able to be here. So thank you to our table leaders for including them. We have a lot of great thought leaders here today, and I know that the students will really benefit from hearing your dialogue and your voices. I was fortunate enough to have those experiences when I was a student, and so I can recognize now how much it helped shape my own thinking and my own journey. For our second purpose for today, USask adopted a sustainability strategy in 2021. And part of my work in sort of leading the implementation of that strategy, again, is a lot of what we've spoken about today. I mean, it's the nurturing and convening public discourse. It's talking about sustainability, talking about the SDGs, really trying to find ways to help move to action, engaging in dialogue, developing that shared understanding, and then building bridges and creating portals through which external partners, like many of you, can effectively engage with the university. We want to hear those perspectives and find, as we keep saying, shared action as we move forward on some of these very, very critical issues. So when SDSN asked if we would host this conversation in Saskatchewan, I could really see how it was an opportunity to invite you here for a relatively small event with meaningful conversation, exchange of ideas, and connection. I know a lot of great work has already been done in Saskatchewan, and that there's a lot to celebrate and recognize, and yet then there's also this sense of urgency that we've heard about this morning. There's so much more to explore, new ideas to consider, different voices to listen to, and a sense of urgency around many of the goals and the impacts that they're having on our community. So with that, again, welcome and thank you very much for taking time out of your day today. We are going to, I know it's warm in here, and we're going to spread out a little bit. Lunch is available at the back, so I'm going to ask your table leader to decide when it makes the most sense for your table to go for lunch. It might be right away, maybe they'll want to, have people introduce themselves or move around a little bit first. So we will have the food available, so you can sort of take that as it makes the most sense for your table. We are going to have table 4 move and go to a different room. Again, just give people a little bit of a chance to spread out a bit. They'll be moving up to C280, which we call the green room. So please, you will be able to head there shortly. And then maybe we can also just shift around if maybe table 2 or something wants to move over. We can make sure everybody has enough space. I appreciate it's a little bit crowded in here right now. Again, we want to sort of have a bit of a working lunch today so that we're maximizing the efficiency of our time together. As I mentioned earlier, we will be breaking around 2 o'clock. We'll have a short break at that point, and then we're just going to come back together for 35, 40 minutes, because I would love to hear and have the other groups hear sort of a bit of a summary of your conversation at your table, so that we can learn from each other and learn a little bit more about what was discussed. So another role at your table, and I'll mention this closer to 2, is you'll have to just decide if you'd like to ask your student note taker to summarize, if the table leader would like to do that, or if there's someone else at your table that would like to do that. And we will end by 3 o'clock on the dot, as I recognize people have busy schedules and things to move on to. So with that, I will just ask everyone to move to your table if you haven't, and maybe table 4 can grab their lunch and then head on upstairs. Thank you.